I was thinking about, for a long while, taking what I usually make in the studio and wanting to scale it up, using material which didn't have any sign of my own hand, and setting up a system and then letting that system dictate or maybe contain its own aesthetic decisions. Not even that it's an aesthetic decision, it's just a system which is just doing what it does if you give it the right environment. There seemed to be a sort of a universal truth to the idea that you would just let nature, under the right circumstances, do what it needs to do. At the time I was crystallising mostly engine works, and it seemed that once you started the process up, once you had the right proportions, the right temperatures, that it seemed an unlimited process. And then it came to be apparent that maybe it wasn't so much an object that needed to be crystallised, maybe it'd be interesting for something stranger perhaps. Well, Seizure was made in 2008 and it was commissioned by Artangel. When we started this process, there was no guarantee that this was going to work. We talked to our supplier of copper sulphate, an Italian company that sent us 2 shipping containers full of blue crystal powder, quite a lot of chemical. When you fill a bedsit full of chemicals, you have to leave it for a while, and so we left it in that state, taking its temperature daily. It lost a degree a day, which was very unusual. We thought it would take a lot longer. So after maybe about a month or so, we found that the cooling had reached a certain level. And simply we sucked the liquid back out again. And once we sucked the liquid out, it became apparent that the crystallization had happened. And it happened on a scale I think that we weren't anticipating. To some degree, we got it wrong in terms of what we were expecting, but we got it wrong on the right side of being wrong, I think. Taking Seizure from London and building this building, there's a sense that the object itself is becoming more of what the intention of Seizure is, somehow, this rather unknowable thing, this object which its status is quite unusual. And for me that works very well. It's an important sort of maybe factor in how we're supposed to maybe go about things in the future. Seizure is in a sort of a semi-storage in a way, and so we wanted to find a building which was going to allow this limbo to continue.
The design involves a really complex set of overlapping issues. I mean, some are relatively straightforward, like just the environmental care of the object. The crystals, they can't get wet. That could degrade them. They don't want to get too hot, so you have to protect them from kind of hot sunny days, things like that. So there's a kind of simple level of environmental care. And then what does it mean to relocate this work from kind of its original host condition as being temporary and within a housing block that was redundant to this glorious landscape? And then there was this really interesting part of the brief, which was that the building had to be demountable because it's sited here for 10 years for now and it might move on. It's a really kind of interesting working relationship with the artist, with Roger, who is really having to kind of completely reframe his work. So that's a kind of very, very kind of live issue about how to accommodate a piece of art.
I think it was important to have a very sympathetic environment, and that environment not to impose on the artwork itself. And so we went through a very long conversation with Adam about how to go about presenting or to cover Seizure with the building. It was in a pretty undefinable region in our imagination when we were talking about it. It was sitting in a car park in Yorkshire. And so when we were coming to the idea of building this building, we talked about materials, we were talking about the protection of this very fragile object, but we were also talking about how people are going to experience it. And so Adam was great in completely accepting and understanding those very sympathetic and very complicated ideas about how the public are supposed to interact with this strange thing, with this object.
I think there was an intuitive sense right from the start that the enclosure had to have a kind of certain mass and a weight to it. It might have been more obvious to have a lightweight, demountable structure, but both in terms of the kind of environmental control and in terms of just the intuitive kind of feel and the frame that the work needed, it felt that something much heavier and much more solid was needed. The kind of precedents that really informed the structure are quite wide. I mean, it goes with the territory of the work, that the kind of range of reference and the things that the work kind of calls to mind are very wide. But in terms of the structure, I mean, the starting point would be really good industrial sheds. It's interesting that there were pre-cast concrete kind of farm buildings in the 1950s. You don't really see anymore. So there's those kind of things. Then there are also another kind of register of Egyptian tombs, Egyptian kind of classical architecture, the stuff that's at the kind of really foundation of classical architecture. So there's a certain sense of proportion and weight and kind of measure. The light is a really important part of the design. I mean, there's a practical aspect to it, that you are coming from broad daylight through to a very dark space. The interior of the work is lit by a couple of bulbs, but it wants to be a magical moment. You want to have already adjusted your eyes to the darkness. So there's a practical sense of a threshold of adjusting to darkness. The rawness of this concrete kind of post and panel frame with the cracks of light coming through. It gives you a very subtle but kind of amplified connection to the outside.
I try as much as I can to try and escape my past when it comes to making artworks. I had hopefully a healthy attitude towards life, which means that there is no consistency, there is no straight line. If you can encourage as much difference in your life, I think it's important. And I think that having a process which takes over and you just make work towards that is artificial. It's not a real life somehow. You're just enabling the production of your own work. And I don't believe that that's a useful way of behaving as an artist. I don't think there's any truth in it. It would take a lot for me to become enthusiastic about doing something again like this. I think because it's been done once, it doesn't necessarily need to be done again. And I think if you did it again, it would be for economical reasons, and it's probably not the most interesting reason. It was very important that you didn't, for instance, wake up one afternoon and crystallize a bicycle because it seemed like a nice thing to do. It just seemed that you wanted to give this process which had a lot of weight to it and a lot of seriousness, I think, the crystallization process. And I think it was really important to continue that and to choose the objects accordingly. And for me, it was always important to choose the dominant objects in the world, which we surround ourselves by.